Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to another episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue exploring intracranial pressure disorders. And in this case, I'm joined by Dr. Bernadette Hard, who wrote of her experience of spontaneous intracranial hypotension on the website of the CSF Leak Association. And you are a trustee of that organization, aren't you, Ben?
Yeah, that's right.
Bernadette grew up in Wales, an only child surrounded by horses and dogs. And after studying medicine in London, her fascination with human behavior drew her into addiction medicine. And she worked there for 20 years, much of it alongside people facing extreme marginalization and street homelessness. She chalked up an achievement of this experience as the introduction of long-acting depo buprenorphine in Wales in 2019. But the rollout was during the pandemic. That must have been a bit of a challenge. We'll be exploring her experience of spontaneous CSF leak. And she said this came on the tail of a workplace trauma that resulted in PTSD, an experience that she said shattered the self she thought of as herself. She said the project of reconstruction from those fragments is ongoing. And from the picture she sent me, it has a lot to do with the love of horses as well. Bernadette Hard, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and thank you very much for sparing time for me today.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Why did you decide to write about your illness experience?
Well, the short answer is that I was asked to write a sort of short description of what happened to me for the CSF Leak Association. And I actually found that when I started describing the whole experience, it was really helpful, a helpful experience, because actually it's quite a difficult thing to describe to somebody that has never had a CSF leak and has never experienced low pressure. It's almost one of those things that you can have academic knowledge of it, but unless you've had an experiential knowledge, then words just, they come close, but it's very, very hard to really put it into words. And so, I felt that was the more people that tell their story. And for instance, on our website, I found it really helpful to read other people's experiences. And since then, having my sort of story up on the website, I'm sure other people have been able to identify and maybe find words to help them describe their own symptoms, which is one of the hardest things, when you go into the consultation with a neurologist and you kind of dry up, you've got it all in your head, but then you find yourself just going, or, it's really hard to describe exactly what you're experiencing in a meaningful way.
It's not the most common of neurological diagnoses. It's probably out there in the hinterland, so to say. Not many doctors are aware of it. Are you planning to write a book about it? I found very little written by patients on this illness.
Well, that's encouraging. I definitely think that, a lot of people think they have a book in them somewhere, and I've got a couple in my head sort of swirling around. And, the thing that stops me is, who would want to read, my experience? Because there's so much out there to read that I almost think, well, it's kind of almost a bit narcissistic to think that anyone would be interested in my sort of story. But then the experiences that I've had in the last few years have made me think, well, maybe it's worth writing a map, because the journey that I had, it crashed me into a place where I literally was in despair. And there were months and months where I just couldn't see how I was ever going to get anything together again. And it would be like fighting your way out of a jungle. If you fought your way out, it seems the decent thing to do to maybe draw a map, because other people will be able to maybe follow that. Maybe it's not their map, but, it feels like a helpful thing to do at some point.
Well, one of the reasons I invited you is because you have this dual role as a patient and a doctor. So I think, that's kind of gives a broader perspective.
Yes.
what was your life like before this illness? And just, I know it was kind of fast paced. What were you up to leading up to this?
Yeah, I mean, working in the addiction services as I had been in South Wales for the last couple of decades, it had gradually got busier and busier. I'm sure a lot of people identify with that. Small children becoming older, doing more activities, more clinics being added, more financial burdens, bigger house, bigger, kids want to do mountain biking, horses. Every hour becomes crammed. You think you can take something else on and something else. So it was very busy. I would get up very early. I would run. I would do the horses. I would get kids to school. I would do 2 clinics. Had a private company as well that I was running. I would work most weekends. I would also find time when I got home to go riding, paddle boarding, was learning to skydive. It's hard now to think about it and think, how did I have enough hours in the day? But I took that for granted that I could go at that pace. And I think that I took a lot of my health for granted. But yeah, it was a very active life, and it was full of opportunities.
Well, they say people regret the things they didn't do rather than the things.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And you said your career took you to some of the darkest corners of society. Are you referring here to the homeless or something?
Yeah. I didn't have a clear idea when I got into medicine what it was that I wanted to do. I think a lot of people maybe don't. And I sort of bounced around and thought I would be a hospital medic for a while, and then went off and did some general practice. And that it was all right, but it wasn't really sort of inspiring me. And then quite by chance, I got some work in a prison, and it just totally fascinated me. And that was sort of one of the areas where I sort of started to get curious about substance misuse and about people's lives, how they got there, how they got to the pickle that they were in, and what was the backstory. And I suppose I went into that thinking, why would you have done the things that you did, how bad they were for you, how bad they were for everybody else around you. And then when I listened to their stories, I would be asking a different question, having had such a horrendous experience quite often, what made you want to stop? I totally understood why they would want to be sort of in oblivion almost a lot of the time, or blanking out their feelings. And I also found there was something quite freeing initially about working in addictions. The people that I was working with, very straightforward. They're angry with you, they're going to kick something or slam a door. It's a very emotionally almost honest environment to work in. And it's one of the areas of medicine where it almost like it's quite primitive, in that small things you can do can actually make an enormous difference, rather than, the number needed to treat. Perhaps if you're giving, managing someone's antihypertensives or something like this, it seems a very slow burn. But actually, if you've got someone with a severe heroin addiction and you manage to help them to get stable on a treatment and you support them in their recovery for something which is relatively straightforward to do, it can have a transformational effect for that patient, but also for their family and also for the wider society, So I felt that it was an area where it was still possible in Western medicine to make a really big, impactful difference. And then I guess, of course, the further down you go, the more severe the addictions, the more severe the social problems, the greater the opportunity for redemption and change. And when you see that change, it's really rewarding and motivating. So that was where the journey took me. But one of the things that sort of really lifted me was when we were able to introduce this new treatment option. And in substance misuse, there aren't many treatment options. And when we were able to introduce the long-acting version of buprenorphine, which meant that people could have a month at a time of their treatment, because it was done as an injection, there was a certain percentage of people that we simply hadn't been able to reach before, who were really did so well on that medicine that it changed them quite shockingly, quite quickly. And we didn't think we'd get funding to roll that out, but it was actually a kind of happy coincidence that the pandemic came along. And of course, having someone being able to take that medicine once a month and not having the daily contact with the pharmacist and not having the associated risk of a litre or two of methadone, being stored at home where there may be children and, it might get diverted. It was a win-win. And the Welsh Government saw it as that and gave us a significant amount of latitude to roll it out, which we did.
Okay, let's kind of drill down on your illness. A stressful event that you said threatened key aspects of your life.
Speaking very broadly, without any specifics, there was a very serious incident that happened in my place of work. And I was essentially a whistleblower for something that was unsafe and illegal. And it served as a catalyst for events that resulted in me fearing for my life in a room with a patient who was known to be very, very high risk. And then subsequent to that event, the senior management team were not only lacked any kind of support for me, but attempted to sort of almost a gaslighting and attempted to sort of almost make it that it was my fault. And that didn't stick, but it was, talking about it now, I still feel stressed, to say the least. And on so many levels, that incident shattered my understanding of my world in relation to the colleagues that I worked with and the environment that I worked in. And of course, those events, your mind just goes into overdrive because there are so many aspects to it. There's the threat to professional reputation, there's the threat to security, there's the sort of financial threat, what will happen today, tomorrow. There are too many issues to sort of consider all in once. The only way I can describe it is that my brain at that point, it just felt like it was on fire as I was trying to find a route through this dystopian situation that I found myself in. And I guess, biochemically that would translate to, cortisol levels through the roof, permanently sympathetic nervous system switched on in a kind of fight or flight. And I guess physically incredibly wearing, it would be like having a car and putting no oil and revving the engine, just, it's going to break. You get the feeling that something will break you. Our bodies were not meant to run like that at that pace, and this went on for sort of 6 weeks till my leak.
And we talk about the leak. Do you think this kind of the stage then kind of the body was ready to leak? Let me put it that way. Do you think
something was going to go? Something's got to give. You cannot go on like this. I was just in such a stressed state that I was in this hyper arousal, hyper alert, hyper stress state. And there was little telltale signs, small things like, normally I don't bruise very easily. And I went for a blood test and my arm just went completely, half my arm was black and they hadn't missed or anything like that. So you're starting to, I started to develop sort of allergy reactions to things and sort of coming out in rashes, being very sensitive. And it was almost like the alarm that I felt psychologically was being replicated on a cellular level. My whole body was under threat. And my way of understanding that is that, on a cellular level, your body can either be in flight or fight, or it's in rest and repair. And it cannot be in both.
And it's in that background that you developed this headache. Tell me about it.
Yeah, it was really quite a shocking thing. The first inkling I had was that it was a Saturday evening, and I was sitting down watching telly, and I thought initially that perhaps I'd moved awkwardly, and I felt this sort of strange jolt back of my neck, and then thought, oh, my head doesn't feel very good. It was not like I'm not a headachy person. I probably had a headache only a few times ever, and so I thought, this is odd. I've just suddenly developed a headache, and it was all over my head, and it felt strange. It's not a pain that I've ever experienced before, so it's hard to put it into words. But I took 2 paracetamols, went to bed. And actually, I woke up and I was fine the next day. And I had a pretty normal day in that I went and rode the horse. The following day, I was flying out to Malta for a conference. While I was on my way to that conference, I received some email correspondence relating to the incident, with a lot of attachments, and they were very, very hard to read. And up until that point, I'd been, although inside I felt like I was, screaming, on the surface, I was keeping a lid on it. I was rational, I was logical, I was relatively calm, coherent. I'm not a panicker. And it was at some point during the day when I was sitting in my hotel room reading all these papers that I just totally lost it. And for the first time in years, I was sobbing hysterically. It was almost like it hit me, the enormity of what had happened. The whole situation just totally overwhelmed my capacity to cope at that point. And it was a couple of hours after that, I'd kind of calmed myself down. I'd gone for a walk in Valletta, had a sandwich, and the same thing had happened 2 or 3 days ago. But this time it was, whereas it had been maybe a 2 out of 10, it was an 8. So it was first of all, sudden, literally, I can pinpoint the point at which it happened, a jolt in the back of my neck, slightly to one side, like you'd cricked a muscle, really, like that, something popping, a sensation like that, followed by a gradual build-up of a sensation which, if you've never experienced it, it's almost impossible to put it into words, but it is actually a heaviness inside my whole head. Now, I now know that is my dura and whatever the bits that have nerve supplies experiencing the weight of my brain. So, now it's floating again. I'm not aware of my brain. I can't feel it. But at that point, I became aware of it. And initially, it wasn't a pain. It was just a very odd sensation, a sensation that there was something inside my skull that was heavy. And you could feel it. I could feel it as I moved my head. It was like, doof, doof, what the hell? And then within 5 minutes, it was not just an unpleasant sensation. It was pain, and it built to. So I thought, again, you don't think, oh, I've had a CSF leak. It didn't cross my mind. I think, I don't know what this is. Is this some kind of really nasty, virus I'm coming down with? I don't know. Again, some simple painkillers, go to bed. Woke at 5, felt worse, went to the bathroom to get some more painkillers. Very, very quickly, the pain had gone from 5 out of 10, this isn't great, to a 8, 9, I can barely stand. I can't even get water out of the sink to get a drink. Got back into bed, thought if I can get a few more hours, maybe I'll wake up, it'll be gone, Woke up. Did drift off, I think. Wet worse. Thought, I'll have a shower. Totally unable to tolerate it. Had to get out of the shower. Just almost distracted by the level of pain by this point. So I'm maybe like an 8 or 9. Hard to have a conversation. Hard to think. Hard to remember my room key as I was going to breakfast. That kind of, I can't cope. I can't. There's no space in my mind for anything other than managing this pain. Tried to sit down and have something for breakfast, couldn't, thought I got to find a solution. 3 doors down from the hotel, there was a chemist. So I went in. I didn't know where to start. I'd never been to Malta before. I was on my own there. I asked for some strong painkillers. Can I buy something for this headache? And of course, that's not straightforward. And very quickly I thought, I think I must have started crying, and I said, I didn't know what to do. And then I said, I think I'm going to be sick, which always gets their attention. So very quickly, I was in the back office of these lovely people, vomiting into the toilet. And of course, I was kneeling down and my head was resting probably on the toilet bowl. And I thought, I can cope. I can cope when I'm down here. It's when I stand up that the problem occurs. So I then said, look, let me lie down. So I was on the floor with my head in a towel that I'd had in my bag, just saying, give me 10 minutes and then I'll get myself together. I'll think about what I can do. I'll just get over this. Well, obviously they were worried, so they'd phoned somebody. A lovely elderly doctor turned up. I think he possibly thought that I had, acute, severe, like meningitis or a subarachnoid. Something was very seriously wrong in my head. An ambulance turned up. Somebody rang an ambulance. Very shortly, I heard the sirens. Next thing I knew, I was being taken to a hospital. On the way there, I thought I might die. I thought I could be dying, and I felt terribly sorry for myself. I just felt very, very sad, and that I could possibly die, and that I wouldn't see my kids again. That would be it. That was the end of my show, my experience of the world. Anyway, I was very lucky because I was rushed into the hospital. I was put straight into a CT scanner. Normal scan. Okay. Blood tests done straight away, CRP under 10, and I'm thinking, okay, I do not have something like a massive brain tumor or a bleed or anything like that. And I do not have meningitis. And they were the two things that were at the top of my list that I thought could kill me quickly. But I still knew I was really ill. And at that point, I was then thinking, they're just going to discharge me. They're going to say, you've got a bad headache and, you've overreacted. That and almost the shame of that would be terrible, that I just had a headache and that here I was in a 999 and I was being so dramatic. Anyway, I had to get off of my journey to go and have a pee in the A&E department. And the headache had got to the point where I was able to cope. I was concentrating, I was clutching my head, but I was managing it. Within a minute of being upright, of course, having walked to the toilet, I was literally on my knees with how severe this pain was. Just totally, almost to the point where I felt like a blackout. And that was the point when I thought, oh, this is positional. This is to do with my... And I learned about high pressure in medical school. I learned that you wake up in the morning because you've been lying flat and your head is bad. And I knew to ask people about that symptom. And I thought, this is the other way around. Okay. This must be low pressure. And then I Googled that. And sure enough, I found, yes, this could be low pressure. And I was thinking about it in my mind. Fortunately, I was referred to neurology. Some neurology registrar came along and said, we think you could have a CSF leak. Okay. Now what they did at the time, which was probably, I now know, not the right thing to do, but then there's no CSF leak service in Malta, and they were doing their best. They're not specialists in this. They did a lumbar puncture. They took me up to the ward where there was free beds and nurses and no queues, and it was lovely and peaceful and quiet. They did a lumbar puncture, and the pressure in my CSF was incredibly low. I think it was 2 or 3. And I remember thinking at the time when they were measuring it, I haven't made it up. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Patients, you don't want to be sick, but then actually you're almost a relief when they find something that's wrong with you, because you didn't want to make a fuss either. They were very good. I had an MRI scan which confirmed that there was cerebrospinal fluid leaking out of the area where it should be along. It's a longitudinal epidural collection, so they could see that along the thoracic and the lumbosacral scans on my MRI spine. And they could see the features that go with low pressure on my head scan. And then obviously they did a second scan, and what followed was that quite characteristically, I developed some bleeding on the brain. I had subdural hemorrhages, which at the time was very, very scary, but now I know is an associated sort of finding as the pressure volumes switch around and you get blood coming into the space. So yeah, that was the acute side of things.
For the non-medics, the normal pressure is about 10 to 20, so two is quite low. And presumably then between your CT and your MRI, you are leaking quite a lot then, because the subdurals were not picked up on the CT, but by the time you had the MRI, they've developed.
Yeah. So the first MRI actually didn't have much in the way of collections, hygromas, subdurals. The second MRI was done about 5 days later, and they were quite significant. So yeah, it was all, the CT was normal, but I guess they're not going to pick up the CT head anyway was normal, and that wouldn't have picked up the changes. The MRI initially showed brain sag, and I think some swelling around the pituitary and some loss of the angle where my cerebellum had kind of sunk downwards. The second scan then looked worse, as all the fluid shifts were happening in response to the low pressure. Over the next three to 4 weeks, it gradually improved in terms of the symptoms to the point where by the end of the first 4 weeks, I could be upright for a couple of hours. I could bear it. I did take some cocodamols over the first few months, but reevaluated that once I realized that this was a long-term condition and that was not going to serve me well. The meditation thing really helped me. I mean, I can't underestimate how much that helped me. I'd started meditating years ago because I had quite an interest in Buddhism and sort of the Buddhist Eastern philosophies and the traditions around that. But I don't think I'd ever gripped onto it in the way that I did when I found myself in this horrible situation. I suspect that it actually, by causing me to be more relaxed, probably reduced the experience of, the emotional experience of pain as well.
I was having dinner with a colleague last night, and he was talking about how meditation causes a shift right to left. It's a left to right shift.
Left to right, yeah.
And the right part of the brain is the one that can detach. And
yeah,
that's an interesting concept. So your headaches eventually subsided, but you wrote of an array of fun symptoms, including kestrel. What other symptoms were you?
Well, I think as the pain became more manageable, and it never went altogether, but it was much less acute, more of a background, dull, constant ache than something that was all-consuming. The other symptoms that I now know are related to the pressure changes started to occur. The tinnitus, which is a very weird sort of mechanical noises, whooshes, clanging, chunking, bizarre clunking noises that go on, that come and go, that seem to be dependent on how bad the leak symptoms are. So it's almost like it's going in conjunction with how bad the headache feels. And the other symptoms were sort of neck pain, back pain, some blurred vision, some double vision, some funny symptoms, that metallic tasting on my tongue, weird, odd, almost like I could taste my own tongue. As I got all these symptoms, I would then, remind myself of the brainstem and the various cranial nerves, and it was almost like I could relate them to the whole thing sinking down and the nerves coming off it being tugged, or inflamed. So they were all being affected by being slightly in the wrong place, like someone had got hold of your car and given it a tweak, and nothing quite worked right anymore. And then the cognitive stuff, which I think actually was possibly the hardest to live with. Because, what I haven't seen is any really robust neuropsychiatric evaluations or neuropsychological evaluations on patients with leaks. We know that there is this link between having a leak and then long-term developing frontotemporal dementia and severe cognitive impairment. We know then that somewhere in the meantime, vast majority of patients with a leak will describe brain fog, is what they describe, this kind of fogginess, difficulty in concentration. But what I don't think is that it's not a binary thing. It's not like one day you're fine and then you've got frontotemporal dementia. It's a continuum. And your cognitive abilities are fluctuating anyway. If we tested people on different days, they would have different results. It's not completely level all the time. But all that was ever really evaluated is, do you have capacity? It was almost like a mental test examination. If you know the day, the week, the year, who the queen is, you can have a relatively, queen at that point, king now, you can have a relatively coherent conversation. Then there's nothing wrong with your cognition. You don't have dementia. But actually, it's way more subtle than that. It's way more complicated than that. I had significant cognitive impairment. So what I would describe as brain fog. So there was definite cognitive impairment, that correlates with what people describe as brain fog, which means that it's not that you can't do cognitive tasks. It's that those cognitive tasks that normally are effortless have a huge load. So, for example, using two-factor authentication was a massive effort. Having to take those steps and use two devices and put in a number from this one onto that, it made my head hurt just to do it, to hold all that information at once.
You said your mind felt unplugged from the machinery required to articulate thoughts. I thought that was a good way to put it. And then you said you became like a human barometer. Low atmospheric pressure seemed to add weight to the cement in your skull. How did you realize this?
I don't know. I have looked up and done some. There was an evidence base there that this is a thing that's described. I spoke to my treating neurologist, Professor Matharu, and he acknowledged that it's been known for a long time, certainly in relation to migraines, that symptoms get worse according to weather. I absolutely could not deny that the weather affected the level of my pain and my cognitive impairment. I could kind of know I'm going to have a good day because I see 3 nice blue clear skies for 3 days in a row, and I will be able to get those emails done. I will be able to focus. I'll be able to concentrate on those days. And on these days, and it was, my leak happened in October. I came back to the British winter. On the days where I was going to have those very heavy, very foggy, very overcast days, it was going to be incredibly difficult for me to do anything productive. And it almost felt like the pressure was, it felt like whatever had been protecting my brain from the fluctuations was no longer working effectively.
And another thing you talked about making your symptoms worse was being in a moving vehicle.
Oh, yeah.
And is it jolt or is just the motion itself?
I think both. So definitely jolting. We have a very bumpy drive, and I ended up with one of those travel cushions, that I would sort of push just to sort of almost feel that there was some, almost like whatever was meant to be stabilizing my head wasn't, and I could cushion it artificially, and hold it, and that made things a little bit better. But then for short journeys, but then for long journeys, even if we were sort of motorways and whatever, by an hour into it, it would build and build and build until I had a really severe pain at the back of my head. Not pleasant.
one other thing you talked about was the link with hormonal fluctuations. In your research, is that kind of there's a scientific explanation for that, do you think, or is it just an
I
observation?
think there probably is. I don't know exactly what it is. I do, it was the progesterone I'm on HRT, and it was when I took progesterone that the symptoms got worse, and not initially, but maybe a week into it. So as the progesterone levels were going up, and I think there is some link in terms of the fluid retention, third space shifts that will change depending on progesterone levels. Also in pro-inflammatory, so there's some kind of pro-inflammatory properties that go with progesterone. So all that probably added up to a system that didn't have much give in it, and that was enough to really make things significantly worse. Whereas the estrogen on its own for the second two weeks helped. I would function much better. So there was a really tough week in terms of symptoms related to the progesterone.
Of course, lying down was the key thing to improve the symptoms, but you said, rather humorously, I found lying down in a liberal, tolerant, inclusive society is a bridge too far.
Yes.
Did you ever break convention and just lie down?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes, I was doing a little bit of work here and there when I was waiting for my investigations, etc. And I'd go into meetings and things, and I would have to say to people, look, I'm fine. I want to be part of this conversation. I'm able to contribute, but I have to lie on the floor.
Okay.
And people, the reaction to that is that varied. People that knew me well, they were like, yeah, fine, have a cushion, lie on the floor, right? People are clearly quite uncomfortable with it, and it causes alarm. And I hate being in any way a center of attention. And I'd hate the fact that people might think, oh, you're being dramatic. I will try and mask rather than lie down. And so I would do things like sneak off and lie in my car. The other thing that hit me is that actually we're a very upright society. So, I had to travel to appointments. I had to go on a train. You can't lie down on a train. I went to a neurology outpatient appointment in a centre that specialises in CSF leaks, and there was nowhere to lie down. You're in the waiting room. You have to sit up, and it's quite a simple thing to provide a space for someone to lie flat. Really, it's not that difficult.
We found good hydration, moderate amounts of caffeine helpful, and caffeine is one of those conventional treatments.
Yeah.
You said served in buckets of matcha green tea. Tell me about the benefit of tea.
Yeah, I'm not a coffee drinker. Caffeine didn't really agree with me generally. I would get palpitations. I was always been a green tea drinker, pretty weak. But obviously, I was advised to take caffeine when I had my leak because it does increases CSF production. So it can increase the pressure or reduce the symptoms associated with the leak. I took some caffeine tablets. It did help a little bit. But a friend introduced me to matcha, which is it's green tea, but it's made with very fresh leaves. And I actually really like the taste. And they serve it in bowls. So it's not quite a bucket, but you serve it in a bowl and you sort of whisk it up. There's a lovely little mindful sort of ceremony that goes with it that makes it feel like a bit of a special occasion. My husband says it's like drinking pond water, but I quite like the taste. And actually, it helped my clarity of thought and my headache. And it was after I found that it helped that I then looked up and found that matcha does have significantly more caffeine in it than regular green tea, I believe. I'm not a matcha tea expert, but that's what I sort of found on my Google search. But actually, it releases the caffeine in a slightly different way to tea and coffee, or certainly to coffee. So it is probably less likely to cause those kinds of shaky feeling that you can get from too much caffeine in coffee. And I could tolerate the matcha quite well. I didn't get any of the side effects that I would have got off drinking coffee.
And then you came back to the UK. When you came back to the UK, you said you got slammed into the reality of the National Health Service. What challenges did you face as a patient
Uh,
coming
I
back?
mean, I don't know how political that we want to get, but it's hard to get away from how despondently, the NHS is coping at the moment, and how depressing that can be in terms of, years of waiting lists. And it's not until you have to try and rely on it that you realize how decimated that it is. And I speak from a position of relative privilege in that I have, lots of friends who are doctors. And so as being a healthcare professional, you have a significant advantage because you have a kind of backdoor. You can ring a friend, you can text somebody. There is still a degree of professional courtesy. And so my experiences were not as bad as they would have been had I not had that background. But my GP was brilliant because he is a colleague, and I used to work with him. He's great. I had a conversation with him very early on. I was able to give all of my information from Malta. We decided that we needed to be referred over to neurology. He'd never really heard of a CSF leak at this point. I'd done a bit of research. We thought, right, let's go and find a neurologist locally and see where we go from here. Bearing in mind that I came home by air ambulance,
Yes.
and I was brought home to the door in an ambulance, having been an inpatient with these hemorrhages. And I thought, therefore, that the next step in my treatment, having been repatriated, would have been done with some urgency.
Yes.
I was referred to neurology, and I got a letter saying that I was on a waiting list that was 13 months long.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So here I am. I don't know what's wrong with me, really. I've just been in hospital for 3 weeks in Malta. I know I've had bleeds on my brain. I'm in daily pain. I can't drive. No one's telling me whether I'm legally allowed to drive or not. I'm on a load of different tablets that are becoming less effective by the day and giving me side effects. I don't, and I have to wait 13 months for a first appointment. So I, said, no, that's not good enough. I got the GP to help. I was then sent to a hot clinic, a neurology hot clinic. And although I ended up being quite good friends with the consultant that ran the clinic, I think his initial reaction was, what are you doing in my clinic? Why are you here? What is the emergency? And again, there was just this kind of, well, you've had a leak and it might get better and it might not. And we could do a blood patch, but then we might not. And we don't really, we've got some colleagues and they do them. And well, let's rescan. There was just no clarity, I felt. No, and it was probably not, he's not a CSF leak expert. He's actually was incredibly helpful to me throughout my illness. And he wasn't working in a CSF leak service, and he had no CSF leak service to refer me into as such. It was colleagues that had an interest. There might be a favour that an anaesthetist could do, and they could come and do a blood patch. But there was no organised, structured approach that was following any kind of guideline. So it was at that point that I'd found the CSF Leak Association, and on their website they have a page that was basically a list of doctors that offer a CSF leak service privately. Okay. In the UK and outside, there was some in Germany, there was some in America, and pretty much randomly, I thought London's not too difficult. There was none in Wales. I thought London's fairly manageable to get to. I can get there on the train. Let's ring up. First one, Professor Matharu, works in NHNN in Queen Square in London, but also has a private headache service. And in fact, he had a great waiting list to begin with, and I got through on a cancellation. So within a couple of weeks, I had an appointment with him, and I paid for that. I instantly felt that this was someone who knew exactly what was going on. You get the feeling he has seen hundreds of these patients, right? he's got that muscle memory. He listens to my story. His intuition is so strong that he knows what's wrong with me. Yes, he's going to go through the motions of this test, that test, the other, but he's already got there. You know, he knows, he sees the pattern instantly. And the clarity that gave me. So I had a myelogram privately with a neuroradiologist that worked in Queen Square in London, and a second MRI. The second MRI, it was 3 months after I'd had the leak. And because you adapt and you normalize to the new normal, yeah, I was starting to think, oh, maybe it's better. You know, maybe the scan will show it's healing. And I kind of knew from the look in Professor Matharo's eyes that no, it wasn't. Yeah. So the myelogram, I was really lucky. The scan showed that there was still low pressure, that nothing had really changed. Yes. The myelogram picked up the leak on the first myelogram, and it was ventral, so it was, you know, around the front, and it was right in the midline at T11. And it was at that point that they said, this is going to need surgery. You know, you read the papers and it says a third of them will sort themselves out, and then a third to a half of those will, you know, have a few blood patches or maybe a fibrin glue, a bit of an intervention, you know, neuroradiologist sticking needles in your back. Not pleasant, but minor. And then you've got this percentage, this small percentage that's going to end up needing to go on to major surgery. Never in my wildest dreams did I just think, you know, the worst, which is you're going to need major surgery. But he said, that's what you'll need.
What was the myelogram like? Can you describe having that test? What was it like?
Yeah, again, I think, I mean, it's not pleasant, but the most unpleasant thing is that you have to lie in a funny position. So you have to lie on your front, because to get the scapula out the way, the shoulder blades, the most painful part of it was actually 45 minutes with my arms sort of above my head there, where they really didn't want to be. And so I had this building, you know, almost horrible pain in my shoulders by the end. And you're told, stay still, stay still, stay still. It's a bit frightening, you know, but the person that did it, I had absolute confidence in him. I felt very, very well looked after. It's uncomfortable, a little bit of local, stings a bit. Obviously, the needle then goes into the area that they need to inject the fluid into, around the spinal cord. As they injected the fluid, he said he was going to do a saline flush to try and get the contrast to run well. And he warned me that I would feel pressure and that I would potentially feel pain. I guess as it's pressing on the nerves at the base of the spine, sort of the sacrum. And I definitely felt a rush of neurological pain in my buttocks, I would say, and an odd sensation in my head as the contrast flushes around. But nah, I mean, it was fine. It you know, 5 minutes of weirdness, a few seconds of discomfort, and a lot of ache in my shoulders.
And did that put you head down?
Slightly leaning forward, like I was diving off a diving board. Yeah. So uncomfortable, but no. And actually, because I think he put a fair bit of the saline in, I don't know whether this was the case or not, but I had 48 hours of relief of my symptoms. Okay. So my headache was wonderful for the next day.
And how long after did you have the surgery?
So yeah, the myelogram was in March, and then there was a bit of a tussle really with NHS Wales shared services, and I had to sort of in Wales you have to sort of go through a central process. They've legally got to refer you outside of Wales and fund your treatment if they can't provide it, but you've got to prove to them that they can't provide it, and it has to go through a committee. And so there was a bit of that. And then, yeah, my operation was in August of 2023 in London, funded by the NHS Wales, which I am eternally grateful for, because it would have been, well, stretching my budget. I mean, it's you know, very expensive to have that surgery privately.
And they stitched up the leak, or what exactly did they do?
Yeah. again, so it was quite frightening because you never think you're going to have major surgery. So, the whole thing of, again, I thought it's keyhole. They'll just, do something incredibly clever with a tiny little robot and I'll be out within a few, days. But my God, no. So it's a laminectomy. So they took a piece of bone out from around my spine so they could get to it. They then cut through the dura at the back to be able to open out the dura to get to the leak at the front, and then put 4 clips in it.
Okay.
And then stitched it back up again and put some metal work to support where they'd had to take some bone out. Okay. I was totally flat for 6 days after the surgery. I was in hospital for about 10 days.
So major surgery then.
Yeah. And, surgery where you're told that there's a 1 in 15,000 chance of blindness and this chance of paralysis. And, I woke up in my haze and I was like checking, right, I can see, I can move my feet, I can squeeze. I think I haven't lost my continence, almost like a check. Everything's working, pretty frightening.
And what were the odds of success that were given to you before you went in?
Very, very good.
Okay.
Yeah. So Mr. Sayal was the consultant neurosurgeon that did my surgery. There aren't many consultant neurosurgeons that specialize in fixing ventral leaks in the UK. He is one of, I expect you can count them on one hand. I knew that I was in the very best hands that I could get, and that made an enormous difference to me. This is someone who's done many of these operations, and that's rare, isn't it? So because it's a rare operation, he's working in a quaternary centre. He's done 5 years pretty much specialising in fixing these leaks. He's got a bit of a thing for it. He's doing 1 or 2 a week. He's developed a technique. So I felt that actually my odds were very, very good. The studies that have looked at the centres of excellence in Germany, there's some studies where they've looked and they were quoting that, 80 to 90, over 90% of patients were having a radiological cure. In other words, the surgery was successful at fixing the leak. It may not have got rid of the symptoms, but it was fixing the leak. And a very, very low rate of serious complications. So the odds were good, I felt, that it would close the leak and that I would not have significant complications. I may have had some kind of minor, I've got a bit of loss of mobility in my thoracic spine, but it's minimal.
Okay. And long term, how effective has it been?
Hugely.
Okay.
Again, the odds of that were not so good. The stories that I was hearing were that patients had persistent symptoms, often varying issues around pressure, often maybe some migraine that come on afterwards, some POTS, some associated problems with deconditioning, maybe where they've been lying down for a long time. I was incredibly lucky in that the leak was fixed within a year. So I think that the sooner you get it fixed, the better in terms of the outcomes, the long-term outcome. And I had 5 days of very severe headache, I suspect related to high pressure after it was fixed. Yes. So it was absolutely miserable while I was in hospital. But once that subsided, it was like the sky had cleared. My mind was back. It totally lifted. And I cannot describe how, if you've had a level of background pain for 10 months and it has never totally gone away, yes, and then it goes, because you've forgotten it was there, right? You've forgotten what it feels like not to be in pain. It is a high. It is like taking off a backpack at the end of a 20-mile walk and you feel like you could float. I could think again. I had no headache. My tinnitus had gone. Obviously, I got better from my spinal surgery, which took a few months. And touch wood, I'm sealed. I'm cured from the leak perspective.
That's good. And do you live under the kind of fear of recurrence, or you've kind of gone so long without a recurrence that you don't think much about it anymore?
I rarely think about it. I mean, initially, yes, there was that fear that if it was going to leak and it was going to not hold, it was going to happen early. And so then you can become quite hyper vigilant, and I was terribly afraid of sneezing or, lifting anything. As now it's nearly 2 years, most of the time I don't think about it. Um, I, I genuinely believe that the reason, because a lot of patients that have leak, they've either got a connective tissue disorder like Ehlers-Danlos loss or something like that, or there's been some reason or some link between this to make sense of why they had this leak. In my case, I don't have any of that. And so the only thing I can think of was that, something had to break because I was under an immense amount of psychological stress and it was physically affecting me. And I was literally, my body was just something was going to give. And so it has really made me wary of ever subjecting myself to that level of psychological distress. And it's made me a lot more respectful of my health and well-being, the importance of sleep, of doing some mindfulness practice, of being grounded, of having that time to restore.
So that's a lesson for you from your experience. What lessons do you want readers to take from your story?
I mean, in terms of awareness of leaks, it is a rare thing. It's, 4 to 5 per 100,000. But I think that actually one of the sort of key goals of the CSF Leak Association is to raise the consciousness with regard to that as a potential diagnosis. There are a lot of patients out there that probably do have a leak that haven't been detected, that get missed, that get labelled as chronic migraine or other type symptoms. I would love that people like me, in my experience, have a better experience of getting a quick diagnosis and getting a swift resolution of their symptoms so that they, like me, can make a full recovery and not become a burden on, their own life, but also on those around them. It's not nice to have a chronic disability like that and not be able to take part in things. So that would be the key. I also, from my own personal journey, don't underestimate the damage that psychological stress has. Your body is not, well, it is a machine essentially, and if you abuse it, it will break. Yeah. That's the biggest message that I would like people to take away from this. And as someone who is a doctor as well as a patient, be a little more open-minded. I think sometimes as doctors, we can be quite black and white in our thinking, and we can be quite, if it's, the book says this, and not dismissive exactly, but, things are way more complicated. We don't know, we only know a fraction of what's going on. We only have a very small piece of the map. And we should be a bit humble about that, I think. I'm a lot more humble about that than I was.
Well, the rate at which the books are re-edited and reissued should tell us that the knowledge is never fixed, I think.
No.
Okay. From your experience, what are the major uncertainties regarding low CSF pressure or CSF leak? In terms of our understanding of it and in terms of treating it, are there kind of gray areas, or do you think it's
completely? I think we know there are hubs of knowledge and hubs of excellence, in America and in Europe and around the UK, where we have a really clear understanding now about what this condition looks like, how many people might get it, and what is a very sensible, evidence-based way to manage it. What we are lacking is globally, goodness knows what some countries have in terms of a CSF leak service. I would imagine none at all, because, parts of the UK that are not well served. Imagine in the second world countries, third world countries, they're not diagnosing any leaks, so globally we're missing loads of these leaks. I think that there is a lack also of structured approach to commissioned services for managing leaks. That's the problem. So that generally, although the generalists might not be aware of them, I think that neurology specialists, they are aware. They might not be experts in leak, but they're generally aware to think about the diagnosis, as are neuroradiologists. What they lack is a commissioned pathway to deliver care in accordance with, there's now, good UK national guidance that is based on very strong evidence as to how these leaks should be approached, how we should get an early diagnosis, how we should manage them in terms of blood patching, at what point we should be looking to do myelograms. And actually what we know is that, and my case would be an example of this, is that if managed according to clear evidence-based guidelines, this is treatable in the vast majority of cases. That prognosis is hugely dependent on early treatment, that for whatever reason, the longer you are leaking, the poorer your outcome will be. We also know that, for long-term leakers, there are secondary complications like the superficial siderosis and frontotemporal dementia, where you're actually getting potentially permanent brain damage that could leave you with a dementia. It could leave you with balance problems, loss of hearing. And if you're waiting that long, even if you do get effects, you're not going to wind the clock back on those symptoms. There's going to be lasting disability. So I think that's where we should be in the UK anyway, is we should be improving our the commission structure of those leak services.
I hope the managers are listening. Okay, I just want to hear a bit about this, the CSF Leak Association and what you do. You are a trustee.
Yeah.
What do you do as a trustee? And what does the association do?
Yeah, it's a tiny charity. None of us we've got no employees. We're all voluntary. The vast majority of us have had experience of a leak, some spontaneous, some after surgery. I joined relatively recently. I joined about 18 months ago when I got in touch to see if I could volunteer, and I was invited to apply to be a trustee. And so I took that on. We all try and bring to the association what we can in terms of our skill mix. There are some trustees who are more focused on the IT. So actually, one of the majorly important things that we offer is a resource for information, for good quality information. So, there are links to the various research papers. There's links to explanations about living with a leak, of the different types of treatments that we offer that are available. So it's important that the website runs and that the back sort of systems run effectively and that people can join our charity. Then we've got the other thing that we do is we're hoping to work in a kind of co-produced way with academics and clinicians to raise awareness in terms of the healthcare system, but also to take part in research. And the association co-produced the guidelines in conjunction with the academics in National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, led by Professor Matharo's team. They also did some research that looked more qualitatively at the impact of the disability of living with a leak. And that was a really interesting paper. Again, it's all about highlighting how disabling, and potentially there's an economics cost then to suggest that people should get early treatment. So my role in the charity is, as a doctor, and I'm not an expert on CSF leaks, but when it comes to, say, speaking with other healthcare professionals or taking part in, for instance, we're taking part in a call for evidence that the NICE is doing on a procedure. I guess I'm more confident with that side of things. So I can represent the charity from a medical perspective, but absolutely not as a CSF leak expert, just as a patient. And our sort of current project, if you like, one of the projects that we're very keen in the next year or two to get off the ground in conjunction with the academics is to have a CSF leak registry in the UK, which I think is the next key step if we're to build reliable evidence that is strong enough to support an argument for investment in terms of commissioned services. So I'm in the medical subgroup of the charity that's trying to work on that.
A small association, but clearly punching way above your weight.
Well, there's a lot of passion. Yeah. There's a lot of really dedicated, I say it's probably, 10 or 12 people, but they're a hugely dedicated bunch. And it's been a huge help to me, firstly, because of being able to signpost to find the help that I needed, but also just the fact of speaking to another person that's had a leak. Now I take that for granted because I have a community that I'm part of that have a CSF leak. But when it happened to me, I didn't know anyone that this had happened to, and that was huge, being able to connect with other people that went, oh God, yeah, I had that symptom too, or have you tried this, or I totally understand, the day that you're having. I get it.
That's perfect. Well, hopefully this podcast will break the records and spread the news of CSF Leak Association.
I hope so.
Are there any? Well, I've been encouraging you to write your book. Perhaps you write it together with Professor Matharu. I've seen a few books where patients have written with the experts, and
yeah, that's a good point.
I think there is a dearth of books because with the previous other podcasts, I have a choice of what books to use, but with this, the kind of very limited patient experience, and what books for the general public. So, if you do write it, acknowledge me as the person.
I will put you as my inspiration.
Okay. Are there any books you kind of want to recommend? I suppose on this theme about the brain or anything at all, meditation.
Yeah, before I would give him, not that he'll recognize, I would give him a shout out. Before I had my leak, I was a subscriber to Sam Harris's app, which is called Waking Up, and that was where I'd learned the non-dual meditation. Okay. And it was actually, I listened to the conversations on that app, and I did the daily meditations, and it was when I was at the point of probably the darkest point when I literally thought, I was never suicidal, but I did genuinely think, I wish I'd died. I wish that I just wasn't here. I felt, and the worst part of it was that I felt a burden. I felt that I was a problem to someone else. I felt that I was spoiling my family's life because now I was this problem that couldn't do anything. And, I was dragging them all down, which I hated. And it was at that point that I listened to, it was a sort of an online retreat by Joseph Goldstein, who is a Buddhist teacher. And I found that so helpful that I bought his books on mindfulness of thought, mindfulness of emotion, mindfulness of the body. And that really deepened my understanding of how I could cope with what was going on in my day-to-day experience without getting so attached to it and so sucked down by it. And I sort of, that was a pivotal moment in, the point where I learned something that allowed me to cope with the situation that I was in. I couldn't get out of it, but I learned a tool. So that one I would hugely recommend. If I could come up with three, the second one that I read, and I listened to it over and over on audio while I was waiting for my surgery, because it was so hard to get my head around the concepts, was Being You by Anne Ilseth, which is a book about consciousness, which obviously is a bit of a mystery, but, it talks about the brain as a prediction machine, and it made a lot of sense to me. And to understand my experience, that was what was going on in my brain, because being able to physically feel my brain was a very weird experience. You know, my brain is me, and here it is. It can feel itself. It was very odd. So I thought a lot about the brain and consciousness because it was this boulder literally in my mind. And then the third book, again, an incredible work really is the work of Ian McGilchrist, The Divided Mind, and The Master and His Emissary.
Okay.
And that they were, I have not read every word. They are very dense and very thought-provoking, but I've listened to some of his lectures, have read bits and pieces of his book, have absorbed his thesis, which I think is really, it's a different way of being in reality. And when we have these, you know, when life is not going smoothly, you know, let go or be dragged, isn't it? And you have to do something differently. If you can't change reality, you have to change your relationship with it. So they were the three that I would have picked up.
Good recommendations. And that theme about being flexible and adaptable when you hit a hard place like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Bernadette Hard, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful indeed. And to my audience watching or listening, thank you very much. If you enjoyed it, click on the like button, and better still, subscribe either to the YouTube, Spotify, or the Apple podcast so that you don't miss the next episode. And whilst waiting for the next episode, you can try and grab my own book called Surfing the Brain. And there's a bit more information about neurology on my neurology database called Neuro Checklist. But until then, thank you very much for joining me. Bernadette, thank you very much. I'm most grateful indeed.
Thank you for having me.